in 5, 4, 3, 2. All right. Hello and welcome everyone to another Chat and Learn here with Power to Fly, another special edition of Pride all year long. My name is Mariella Marie, and as always, super excited to roll into this next hour with you all. We are going to be talking about something that I'm very passionate about learning about, as I hope you are. And our guest speaker is here to drop tons of knowledge. Before we get started, though, with today's conversation, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping rules so that we all feel comfortable and confident in this next hour. I like to remind us, even though we don't need any reminders, lots of crazy things going on in the world. You could be doing anything else with your time, but you're deciding to be with us for the hour. If you're here live, if you're rewatching, you're also intentionally spending time with us for the hour. So with that said, please participate. We would love for you to turn your cameras on if you feel called to do so. This is a safe digital space. I really pride myself in, holding safe digital spaces, as we all know that there aren't many out there. I'm not afraid to kick people out of the session if we don't respect everyone's voices. So with that said, please participate. I've muted everyone upon entrance just to avoid any background noise. But again, if you have something you want to share, whether it be, your own insights, your own tips and tricks, any reflections, any dreams that you had last night, please hop off mute and share them with us. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat box. If you do hop off mute, you will be featured in our live recording as this is being recorded. So I invite everyone to stop multitasking in this session. If you can, close those windows, give us your full attention so that you can participate. And then you can rewatch this video later and you can vigorously take notes there and share it with your community. So if anyone has any sensitive information and you prefer to be kept anonymous, you can write to me in the chat. You can find me under Mariella Marie. You can write to me there privately and I will flag your question or your reflection and keep you anonymous. Let's see, this is being recorded, as I said before, so if you signed up for this chat, you will be getting a rewatch email with the link to this video, as well as any resources that our guest speaker might bring up throughout this conversation, so be looking out for that email. And the last thing I'll say is we'd love for you to follow us on socials and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can keep up with all the great chats we've got in store. Now, before I pass the mic to our guest speaker, I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. If this is your first time joining a chat where I moderated before, as I said, my name is Mariella Marie, originally from Los Angeles, California, currently live in Patagonia, Argentina, the original lands of the Mapuche people. And I loved speaking about the importance of emotional intelligence at home, at work, and at play. So I might bring some of my reflections to that note. If anyone's interested in philosophizing, feel free to join there on the EI conversation. Otherwise, I invite you all to support my project that is called The Positive Force Team. You can go to thepositiveforceteam.org, sign up for our newsletter. Otherwise, I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our guest speaker who's calling from Northern California today. Vivienne, I won't read what's on the screen here. I would love to hear in your own words, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to learn about Power to Fly, and what you're excited to share with us today.
Absolutely. Boy, what to share about myself. Obviously, there's the clear lack of honesty in that wonderfully touched up photo of me. But I sometimes jokingly and not say that I have the coolest job in the world. I'm a professional mad scientist. People bring me problems that they can't figure out how to solve. And if I think my team and I can help, then I pay for everything and we try and come up with a solution. And if it actually works, we just give it away. So it turns out it's the worst startup idea ever. Everybody's got problems and there's no revenue. But, I get regularly emails and messages on social media like, my daughter has 500 seizures a day, please save her life. Or my son, 8 months old, just had a stroke. Or our company. We know we have bias in our promotion process, but we don't know how to actually quantify it and figure out how to change it. Or our country doesn't know what to do about education policy, or what is AI going to do to jobs? The only thread through all of them is people. I'm interested in problems that have to do with people. I can geek out with the best of them, about nerdy technical stuff, but I'm just not particularly interested in someone's blockchain idea to sell t-shirts or self-driving cars, other than the impact they might actually have on people, literal and otherwise. So that's what I do. I got my start as a theoretical neuroscientist. The reason I'm in Berkeley is because my wife and I were both faculty here at one time. And then I had the foolish idea of starting companies in ed tech, jointly founded with my wife, and then in workforce, and now in health and public health. So again, the idea that I get to spend all of my money helping people is pretty wonderful. It is something I hope that I get to do for the rest of my life.
And I would say it's pretty uncommon. I would say that it's not necessarily a bad thing. You said it's a horrible startup model, because hopefully, we can see more people like you putting people over profits, and that will hopefully spark, the change that we are asking for. So thank you in advance. I'm really excited to learn more about you, as I know you will share when we dive into these questions. But for now, I would love for you to set the stage, talk about some of the principal themes for today's conversation, and you can read what's on the screen here, or you can, dive deeper if you'd like.
Hey, why don't I start off by reading the screen, and then I'll add snarky comments. Mostly about myself. The positive impact diverse backgrounds can bring to AI. It may not shock everyone listening in here to know that there is a type to the people building artificial intelligence in the world today. It's not one person, but it's certainly there's a disturbing lack of people that have had the world step on them one too many times actually building this stuff. And it influences what we think is an important problem, or even the right questions to ask, which I think is under-discussed for any of you that might be AI nerds. The right question is an under-discussed topic. We spend so much time talking about data, and of course, part of the issue is underrepresentation in data itself causes problems in AI, but there's also just the constraints of, if you've grown up in a relatively privileged life, whatever that might be, you probably don't understand the kinds of questions that impact everyone else's everyday life. Sorry, I've got a giant screen here, and then the camera's right in front of the picture of you all. The value of bringing ethics back into technology. Here's the funny thing. I've had a great many grad students working in this space over the years. Now, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a neuroscientist. I just discovered very early in that career that making fake brains on computers is much cleaner than sticking wires into cats. So I kind of got hooked on the idea that I could build a little thing and it could actually tell whether someone was smiling or not. Now, we can get into whether it can truly tell whether they're happy or a good employee, but just objectively, can it tell if someone's smiling? And even distinguish a fake smile from a real smile? Yes, I got to work on something like that during my undergrad. And it was so cool. I was absolutely hooked. So I don't want to launch too deep into these right off the bat, but I got to say, most of my grad students have been some of the most thoughtful, insightful people with whom I have ever worked. Now, so there is this idea that, boy, if we just had like an ethics seminar for engineering students, it would fix all of these problems. Boy, I wish it was that simple, but I took ethics classes in neuroscience. We've had a questionable track record in acting ethically in my field. And there's a lot of ethics classes in business school. Hasn't magically transformed that space. So yes, it is wonderful that ethics is a big heart of a conversation in AI right now. But one, it's not a new question. And two, unfortunately, like so much else we could be talking about, there isn't an easy answer. And finally, what AI should look like in the future. And I think here, the point being, it's not whether it should look like C-3PO or Skynet. Neither thing has been invented. And it's not really, I mean, I'm a sci-fi nerd and I would love to talk about all that sort of stuff. But if you really want to talk about what the technology that exists today and its impact on the world, then yeah, what should this look like is something that's worth deeply getting into, and on the scale of, well, what actually exists, and how do we make certain that this helps the most people most of the time, and no one group pays an undue burden. And that, again, turns out to be a really complicated story.
Thank you so much for your transparency, for adding, parts of your journey to just help us set up the stage. I'm super excited to roll into these questions. Feel free to go as deep as you want. Anyone who's joined the chats where I've moderated before, you all know I love to go deep. So if we're going to be intentional about this time, go for it. You have full permission. Yes. So before I go there, I just want to shout out where we're calling from. So we had some folks drop in the chat box. Again, our guest speaker is calling from Berkeley in Northern California. I'm on the other side of the world in Patagonia in Argentina. We've got Iran on the line. We've got Berlin, Germany on the line. We've got Michigan. We've got Buenos Aires, Argentina. So if you're just joining us, go ahead and drop in the chat box. Let us know where you're calling from. And then Vivienne, as you're responding to some of these questions, if you know of anything happening where, all of us are connecting right now in this digital space, let us know. But for now, let's roll into this list of awesome questions that you all have submitted. If you hear your question come up and you're here live with us, we want to know you're here, so that we just make sure we get your question covered. If you have a question that comes to mind in the moment, please share it either by dropping it in the chat box, or maybe you can raise your emoji hand or hop off mute, whatever you feel comfortable doing. As I said before, we really want to maximize this time together, so I want to make sure your voice is being heard. All right, Vivienne, let's start with this first question here. What does the current diversity landscape look like in artificial intelligence? Are there any demographics or identities that are more severely underrepresented than others?
Yeah, well, it's not good. And I don't say that as therefore definitionally everything's terrible. Although I frequently speak about the future of work, and one of the things I say is you shouldn't hire individuals, you should hire for teams. And given everything, every piece of research about collective intelligence tells us, a team is not qualified if it's not diverse. Well, AI is not a diverse field. If that's a shock to anyone, then you don't participate in these conferences. So, it's a field, let's be blunt, it's a field where I am the go-to representative of women in AI in many contexts. And if it's not obvious when you look at me, I wasn't born a woman. So I know who I am, but I still feel it's awkward that I'm regularly the only woman on a panel when I did not start as one in this field. So, there are problems there. And even within AI, there are inequalities and complexities. So research on ethics, as anyone who followed, for example, the stories around Google, people doing the sort of social science of ethics in applied artificial intelligence are much more diverse. There's much more gender and racial diversity in that field, which I think actually creates a tension. Because, we're going to be really blunt here. I think a lot of the core people developing in that space are like, these aren't real AI people. They're not building anything. Who are they to come in as outsiders and tell us what to do? Which probably sounds a lot like what you may hear in a lot of diversity discussions. I remember talking to some CTO of a major company, not here to shame anyone, but he was like, yeah, we ran these special programs to promote women and it just didn't work. So we've kind of given up. I'm like, holy crap, if your CEO heard you say that in public, you'd be fired tomorrow. And this is one of the big companies in the world. And to hear a top leadership, particularly technical leadership, speak this way. So, and the funny thing is when we talk about AI, often one of the misconceptions about the technology itself is it's numbers and equations. Therefore, it can't be biased, which is absurd. And anyone that wants to nerd out with me on those details, we can get into it. But of course, it kind of then spills over. It's numbers and equations. So the people doing it doesn't matter, which, then you could start to generalize that to the sciences in general. This is an objective field. We're trying to discover fact. It doesn't matter who's doing it. But we see again and again, here's one of my favorite papers, came out right in the depths of the lockdown from a group of researchers at Stanford. It's an AI paper, but also applied what we call computational social science, which is a truly emergent field, and I love it. So they did something only an AI can do. They read every single dissertation published in every academic field in the United States since 1971, I think. What is it? 1.8 million papers. I may be the only intelligence in the world that read my entire dissertation, because I sure as hell didn't. The title of the paper is going to be a bit of a giveaway: The Diversity Innovation Paradox. So what they found, which really replicates at massive scale within this supposedly objective sciences, what we see everywhere, whether we're looking at the boards of corporations or individual teams in lab problem-solving experiments, which is as diversity goes up. And here it is represented by how much of an outlier was this specific person demographically, gender and ethnicity, compared to their field. So again, no one's going to be shocked here to know that physics, artificial intelligence, my own field, theoretical neuroscience, philosophy, so it's not just about the sciences, philosophy, tend to be much more white and male. Although ethnically, South Asian, East Asian diversity has certainly crept into these fields. Whereas other fields are not. Well, it turns out, field-wise, as diversity increases, innovation increases. And in the case of this specific case, where an AI read all these papers and tracked 4 different measures of innovation, the more of an outlier you were, the more innovative and potentially impactful your dissertation was. And then here's the paradox. The less likely you were to get cited, the less likely you were at every stage, from grad student to postdoc to junior faculty and so on, to get promoted to the next stage. We know, it is unambiguous, that diversity, multidimensional diversity, all sorts of socioeconomic diversity, cultural diversity, but let's not shy away from race and gender. All of these things improve team intelligence. And yet, despite that unavoidable reality, it remains a problem. And I just love the fact that this paper essentially is a representation of both what AI can do to explore a question like this. Most discussions about diversity, innovation, discrimination, and AI are about its dangers, but it's a tool. If you go out and use that tool in a creative way, you can do fascinating things. That's what they did here. But of course, it also shows you, it's almost self-reflective. That very fact means that the people doing this kind of research are unlikely to come across those truly profound questions. When fields are less diverse, what actually ends up happening, and I wrote a paper about this over the last year, about the neuroscience of trust. I know I'm all over the place. Trust me, I could take 8 hours and answer one single question here. I wrote this paper.
We're in the back seat. Please take the wheel. We go.
Lovely. About the neuroscience of trust, to try and understand why this is such a persistent problem. If AI truly is objective, if the business world is supposed to be objective in the sense that it's numbers and everyone wants to maximize their returns, then surely we can't allow all this bias to creep in. But the simple truth is, and I'm being way overly simplistic here, our brains like sameness. When I trust someone who's very much like me, and again, multidimensionally, someone who smells more like me, someone whose intestinal flora and fauna is more like mine, when someone is more likely, not only do I have to put less frontal, all these things that make us human, less frontal effort and activity into sharing trust with them, I actually get a reward. I get little opioid rewards for my nucleus accumbens and dopaminergic rewards. So when I trust someone who's like me, it's easy, and I literally get a little shot of opium. And as someone progressively becomes more difficult, all of that reward goes away, and it's all effort. In fact, the very same parts of your brain you use to actually do your job is competing for resources to trust people that are different. So I fundamentally believe this is an overcomable dichotomy. But if you don't recognize that fact, if you don't accept that we cannot make progress until we recognize that being human is being biased, and that's okay, because we can't be anything else. It is when we refuse to acknowledge it and do something about it that we fail. And that's an amazing thing. AI is, as a field, is insufficiently diverse, and what diversity it has this spectrum between, forgive me, I'm going to use the worst stereotype from each side, a bunch of scolders that have never built anything, to a bunch of ethical automatons that are just spitting out bad ideas. And that is a real problem. We need to integrate these two sides together so much better. And so there are paths forward here, but if AI is like most other fields in science, it will take a lot of work. There's this concept of hysteresis, that the history behind something changes everything going forward. And so overcoming the history of this field, as new as it is going to be incredibly difficult. And I think what I'm really looking for, because this is what has a huge impact, representation at the top. You see, right now people think about, I don't know what we think about when we think about AI. Maybe if you're in the field, you think about Andrew Ng or the co-founders of Deep Brain. And so you have a certain person in your mind, but they aren't the only people building this stuff. And some of the most interesting work is actually going on outside of which ads should I show it to someone, or can we win at, Pac-Man and poker. So seeing that would be a huge advance. By the way, that's a general lesson. Representation from the top changes the choices of everyone coming after. We're never going to promote from the mailroom and solve problems like this. Because why am I going to invest so much effort in my life when I see no evidence that will ever pay off? All right, it's good. This is going to be a ranty talk. So
yes, have another sip of whatever it is you're sipping on. I'm going to reflect on some things that you're saying. I just want to say thank you. Thank you. I also want to highlight that representation is key, but it makes no difference if we have diverse representation, but they're still playing the same game that, historically speaking, hasn't worked, right? Like, that really frustrates me. It's like, okay, we're asking for a space at the table, but we're playing the same game. Well, let's create our own table to a certain extent.
There was a funny comment I got once. An acquaintance of mine, he's Sikh, and if that doesn't mean anything to you, he has very dark skin, long beard, turban. And he's an interesting kind of an entrepreneur. He founds hospitals, and he's been very successful in his life. Politically, he's fairly conservative, but I'm talking about 10 to 15 years ago when that meant something different. So he and I were talking, and I kind of was talking about some of my research in this space of entrepreneurship and creativity and issues of inclusion and diversity. And he was listening. He said, yeah, I look like I look, but I went to Harvard. Everybody on my board went to Harvard. None of us are really thinking about these problems in different ways. That's the value, one of the values here of having a diverse community, is everybody's looking at problems through different lenses and bringing something unique. Otherwise, you get what's often known as herding. People just tend to quickly find one idea that everyone else agrees with, so they agree with it too, and you don't really explore either the full downside or the full upside of solutions to a problem set. So And another one is female representation at board levels. I know this isn't very AI-ish, but some of this is neat because I've been able to explore it using artificial intelligence, which is, it's kind of stalled out. There was this progress in the late 80s and 90s, and then suddenly it hit the high teens, and we have seen only incremental improvement since then. And I'm wondering, and this is really speculative, I'm wondering if we've sort of reached the level of that's the number of women that play the same game that the guys do, but twice as well. And really, in terms of mentorship, they're looking for more young women that are just like them. And so we're not really seeing people with a different perspective coming in and filling these roles. So I'm agreeing with you, but I also have this wonderful piece of research where we I built a bunch of AIs. And again, so much of the story of artificial intelligence is how creepy it is. The following could be very creepy. I turned it loose on the internet, and it crawled to the websites of 60,000 companies, analyzing pictures of people's faces and quarterly reports and earnings and everything. I was looking for the single biggest explanatory predictor, explanatory variable associated with wage gap, gender wage gap. And it turned out, if you just had to pick one single variable, it's the number of female faces in the leadership team. More women, smaller wage gap. So most economists say wage gap is just people's choices. Women choose to work fewer hours. I don't know any particular woman that makes that choice, but there's a lot of research here, including some very progressive economists. So to a degree, I have to take that as a kind of real world data. But to me, it just leaves you with the question, why? If you worked your ass off to get this incredible job, you were top of your school, and now you're in your opportunity, and we're not just talking about women in this case, but this particular paper was on it, why would you choose to work less, knowing it's going to cost you in the long run? And pretty much what we found is you look up and there's no one like you. And then you think, oh, I'm going to work hard, but maybe I'll work hard in my church or on my relationships or in my nonprofit. But I'm working twice as hard as the guy next to me, and he's twice as likely to become CEO. What's the point? And we see the same thing in young kids from underrepresented groups applying to university. And again, really cool using machine learning and AI to explore these questions. But they're the top of their school, they get full scholarships, and then they choose not to go. And on some level, it seems wildly irrational. If you ask them, well, do you think you could pass the classes? Oh, of course I could. Do you think you could graduate from MIT? Absolutely. Then why don't you go? What's the point? If I'm just going to end up back in the neighborhood or back on the farm, why should I bother? Understanding how we change the system and therefore get people to make different choices, rather than just say, oh, this is a marketing problem. If only they understood. Black kids just don't understand the value of university, which is insane. And yet that's been the assumption for like 100 years in most of this field. No, what they understand is no one from their neighborhood has ever gone off to university and have it pay off. So why bother? One single kid from your neighborhood goes to university, that is the single biggest predictor that you will too, more than anything else. It turns out that's even true in Sweden, where people aren't all that different from one another. So having that idea, thinking representation really broadly, it's a powerful thing. But I should shut up so we can do some more questions.
Oh my goodness, please. I mean, like I said, I think that we're here to listen to you, and we're here to, learn together, as this is such fascinating information and research that you're bringing to the table. So please never shut up. Actually, let us know how we can amplify your voice even more. I'm just going to flag a couple of things that are happening in the chat box.
Yes, I noticed a couple myself.
Okay, so I'll flag them here. So Sheila writes, when you say white males are now being joined by East and South Asians, are they still primarily male?
They are still primarily male, although, interestingly enough, female representation, and I'm not getting into the complexities of getting outside the binary just because demographic data does not include stuff like that right now, and I'm trying to just work with the numbers I have as a scientist, but they are more gender diverse than white populations. But it is still primarily male by a lot.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then Sheila also writes, to your point, do you think women choose, in quotation marks, to work less hours because they are only getting paid about 70% of what men are paid, regardless of their merit or accomplishments?
Yeah, I mean, the point is this idea that people make these choices, like, not my fault. Women choose to work less. I'd love to promote them. We get trapped in this world. We particularly in America, where we view choice as some magic wand. I choose to be rich and I choose to be wealthy. If I looked at, this is research by Raj Chetty, who would be my odds-on favorite to get a Nobel Prize in economics at some point soon. And he had this really high-profile piece of research that went by the term lost Einsteins. And he looked at the effects of socioeconomic status on patent production. And what he found, he was able to look at the socioeconomic status of your parents, because it's a long story, but somehow he managed to finagle his way into getting every IRS record ever. So it turns out if your parents are or let's just put it in generic terms, if your parents are wealthy, you are 10 times more likely to earn a patent in your lifetime, to produce a patent in your lifetime, from an academically matched, not a poor kid, middle-class kid. 10 times more likely for a wealthy kid to produce a patent than a middle-class kid. And I think we have a story to tell ourselves in America that, well, okay, maybe we don't do great with poverty and working class individuals, but the middle class has the same shot as everyone else. But actually, that's not what we find here at all. In fact, and again, this is a fascinating aspects of neighborhood effects. A low socioeconomic status family, so lower wages, lower job opportunities, that by quirk happens to reside in a high socioeconomic status neighborhood, their kids look a lot more like the neighbors than they look like their socioeconomic peers. So again, we have all these really interesting role modeling effects going on around us and opportunities where you think, what is choice? If the exact same person in a weird sliding doors world just suddenly makes wildly different choices because the world communicates something very different to them, then yeah, choice is complex. So do women choose to work less? I guess the scope of my story here across those students choosing not to take scholarships, women choosing to work fewer hours, and a variety of other seemingly paradoxical choice behavior is choice itself is inequitably distributed. And it is a function of the lives and the experiences that we have available to us. If your parents are engineers and doctors, then of course you're more likely to believe that that is something you can achieve as well. A new paper just came out that showed that kids from high SES families were 8 times as likely to have careers in creative fields. Well, there's actually, when you look, this is a little complex, so I'll skim over the top of it. When you look at the genetics associated with this, what you find is it plays a very, very small role. This is really just situational. And we could go on. One of my favorite bits of research in recent years, again, not about AI, sorry that I'm not spending as much time on it, but I'm happy to, is all this research done on the Mosu people in South Central China. So Mosu tribes, some are matriarchal and some are patriarchal. And in matriarchal Mosu society, the women are the risk takers, much more so than the men. And in fact, when they enter school with the dominant Han Chinese population, those little Mosu girls are the ones taking all the risks. And yet we have these strong stories in our head that, you know, men are risk takers and women aren't. And while there clearly is some relationship to serum testosterone, things like that, it's not really what you see. So again, this idea of choice. Well, if my grandmother runs the village, and the worst thing that happens is my entrepreneurial endeavor means I have to go work for her because it doesn't take off, I have a lot less to risk than some little boy that doesn't have that kind of internal power. Well, of course, you just flip that and you're applying to most of the rest of the world. Why do women maybe invest less? I mean, I have my own research on entrepreneurship. Women in the US going to start their own companies at 1/10 the rate of men, which is absurd. But if you have a lot more to risk because your earning power is less, unfairly, but true, because VCs are less likely to invest in you, because if it doesn't succeed, you are less likely to quickly find a new job to rescue your finances, then you are much less likely to choose to be an entrepreneur. And risk becomes a complex story about everything society sees in you, not just what you see in yourself.
I definitely, I mean, from my personal story, I remember growing up and I mean, just from the simple and complex visual cue of not seeing anyone on billboards or in movies that look like me. It's like, oh, well, then I can't get that product or I can't have this kind of lifestyle because I'm not represented. And then I'm just, let me know if I'm doing the math correctly here, but I'm going out of my way to find out how to not just accept that and to try to find my the way that I can have, you know, whether it be that product or this lifestyle that's in Hollywood, let's say. You mentioned in the beginning that we like comfort, essentially. We like, you know, we have this bias. And so we fall back on this kind of lazy thing where we're like, okay, well, I don't want to work too hard to try to make things different, or I'm just going to stay here in my comfort zone. Can you speak to, I know it's a simple and complex response that probably that you're going to give me, but can you speak to just how we can try to step out of that? I don't know if it takes more confidence, more, you know, hands on the ground. I don't know what you would recommend, because I do see that, unfortunately, what leads more people playing the same game is the comfort. You know, it's like, well, and then I don't want to go back to poverty, or I don't want to go back to that neighborhood, so I'm going to keep doing this, for example.
So I'll play my role as pompous know-it-all jackass for a little bit. I mean, I do it well because it turns out I'm always right about everything, which is, you know, it helps. But I will also freely confess, I got what confidence I have for free, not simply because I grew up white male in coastal California, but actually almost, this may sound weird, but almost despite it, because when I was a little kid, I was supposed to win a Nobel Prize. I was supposed to be amazing. My dad grew up a sharecropper. I didn't even really appreciate this, because when I grew up, he was this wealthy doctor, you know, and I had the world in front of me. But he grew up a dirt farmer. I mean, just literally nowhere Kansas. Kansans have never heard. Dorothy has never heard of the town he came from. And yet he graduated the top of his class for the entire state of Kansas after just 3 years of high school. And got full scholarships everywhere. And he can go. Because in the words of my grandparents, what's the point of going halfway across the country to some technical school, MIT, if you're just going to end up back on the farm? He went to KU instead, not a terrible school, University of Kansas, tutored Wilt Chamberlain in chemistry, you know, the famous chemist. It's not like he had a terrible life, but he always felt that he didn't live up to his potential. And you may notice, by the way, that's exactly the story I talked about with those underrepresented kids turning down scholarships, to realize how universal it is. Me, the sort of privileged entrepreneur scientist, suddenly realizing, oh my goodness, this research describes my dad. But so I was supposed to do everything that he had the potential to, but didn't. And the more I tried to be that person, the worse everything got. And, you know, if it wasn't for standardized tests, I would never have even managed to get out of high school. And when I did and got off to university, I flunked out and ended up homeless. So the 90s are not my favorite decade. By the way, if anyone listening was not yet born in the 90s, just fuck you for being young and beautiful and healthy. But in 1995, I was literally crossing off days on a calendar until I would end my life. Because what was the point? I'd never done anything worthwhile. I'd only let everyone down, including myself and my parents. Boo-hoo for me. I'd never really been particularly happy. So what was the point? So when I say I got my confidence for free, what I got was a night, pretty much around my birthday in October of 95, where I realized that it wasn't about me. And, you know, that meant a pretty ugly sort of self-confession, which became a literal confession, which is this person who was supposed to be winning a Nobel Prize. I needed to go to my parents and tell them, because I was clever enough to keep it all secret. Yeah, I've been homeless for a couple of years. I just need a bed to sleep in. And I'm going to get a job at a convenience store. And because I'm not going to be this other person. My dream job at that point was to work as a clerk in a bookstore, and I could just read science fiction for the rest of my life and pay my rent, and that would be beautiful. So the funny thing is, and it's not like my life changed overnight. I had a deep hole I dug, but I slowly climbed back out of that hole. And by roughly the year 2000, I suddenly found myself able to go back to school. You know, I'd saved up enough. And it turns out I went to a UC school, and so University of California. So big, giant public school. They don't really care that you flunked out. You want to come back and pay us more money? That's fine. So, so I went back and I did my entire undergraduate in a single year, and I got perfect grades in every class. Same school I'd flunked out of. Notionally the same person, but I learned this incredibly powerful lesson. It's not about me, which sounds like a line. It sounds like a philosophical self-help thing. But let me tell you, I would literally be dead but for that little mantra. Now, my father had something that also really resonated with me, and it took me beyond it's not about me. Live a life of substance. Live a life that makes other people's lives better. You know, into his 70s, when he died of a heart attack, like his 7th heart attack, he was still doing house calls. You know, not some small town doctor. He was still doing house calls, you know, in the Bay Area. It's not like we had a terrible life, but he made it clear that there were things more important than, you know, whether you have the most comfortable life in the world. So what did if I then take that and I get to do research, and I've been asked in a couple of cases, for example, to do research on courage, or to do research to predict the single biggest untracked predictor of work productivity inside one of the largest companies in the world. So not going to mention the company, but here's where AI comes back into the story. Because how often do you hear people using AI to investigate purpose and self-sacrifice? But it turned out those were exactly the biggest untracked predictors inside this population of 500,000 people. I got to analyze everything they were saying to each other in their internal chats and actually track in real time with their knowledge who met around the water cooler and talked to one another. And you could see that one of the most consistent qualities is there were people who made everyone around them better and received nothing back for it. Those people happen to score the highest on a particular psychological construct called strength of purpose. So it's not a specific purpose that you have, but how much are you invested in something that's bigger than you, something that will take more than a lifetime to complete? Why would I continue to bust my ass if I knew I was going to get paid 70% of what the person next to me was getting paid? Or if I had no evidence, intellectually, I understood that the sky was the limit, but experientially, I had no evidence that my hard work would pay off. Well, if you're trying to accomplish something that's bigger than you, if the world gets better when old men plant trees, because they're never going to rest under its shade. But here is another paradox. We talked about the diversity innovation paradox earlier. Here's another one. It turns out that strength of purpose is best understood in terms of people's willingness to take actions for which they will never receive a direct benefit. And yet those very people have better lives. That is a real paradox. It's like I just told you, life is a race, but it's the people that stop and help the other racers that end up winning. It doesn't make any sense, and not in a sort of classic liberal economic sense. But we see again and again, whether you're looking at income and wealth, or education attainment, or social connectivity, or mortality and morbidity, people that are high in life meaningfulness and strength of purpose end up having better lives in almost every way you could mean. So it's a bit of a paradox, but that's my one lesson is build a purpose. Don't find one. There isn't one thing you are meant to do in this world. This is a pretty clear result of the research field on purpose in general, but our finding as well. You get to build it. You get to pick this thing. And my other one is a testament to this won't be easy, which is, so I mentioned I was asked to do this work on courage. Well, I do a lot of different research. And then Grace Hopper asked me to give the closing keynote for their conference and asked me to give a talk about courage. And I'm like, why are you asking me to talk about the one thing I do no direct research on? And besides, the typical closing keynote sort of, hey, go out there and be courageous. Like, it's the episode of The Simpsons where the Krusty the Clown doll was flipped to evil instead of good. And all you had to do was switch it to good, and it no longer was trying to kill Bart. Oh, I didn't realize I was supposed to be courageous. Silly me. Well, I'll be courageous now, as though that is what's entailed. So I looked back at my research and my experiences, because again, your experiences matter. Whether it's science or finance or anything, it's our subjective experiences that define what are interesting questions to ask. So what I convinced myself of, and hopefully someday I'll have a lot more substance to back it up with, is, well, we're all different for a variety of reasons. Courage isn't something you are. You're not just born courageous. Courage is something you practice. You will not be ready to be courageous when the world truly needs you to be if you haven't practiced. I look at many of the sort of notional villains of the sort of technocracy crowd, and I don't have a huge amount of sympathy for a bunch of tech billionaires that are filling their pockets, but I also don't see villains. I see people that didn't practice. And when the world said, there's $1 billion over here and a slightly worse world, or there's $1 million over here, but you get to sleep at night. I guess you can sleep on your billions. It's pretty comfy sometimes, but they weren't ready to make the right choice. And again, when I say this, I could easily be some weirdly self-laudatory thing. I ruined my life. That's how I learned this. I do not recommend that for anyone. In fact, the thing I'd like, the magic potion, is how do we achieve this without people going through what I went through? It is my biggest fear for my kids, is that they have to go through a crucible to be a better person. But here's an amazing thing. Here, maybe my last recommendation. So construct a purpose, something you're truly willing to make a sacrifice for, something that's bigger than you. If that's a spiritual thing for you, that's great. For me, it's a very grounded humanist thing, but turns out the research doesn't care. And because you get to construct it, pick something good. If it doesn't matter, why not do something good? There's a guy in India who's literally planting a forest in front of the advancing edge of a desert. He will be so long dead before that desert reaches his village, but he's doing it anyways, all by himself. Now, I'm not asking everyone to live that kind of life or even doing what I'm doing, but clearly people, I have a poster behind me, so you can imagine you're all contractually, I think, obligated to buy a whole bunch of books. One of them says Small Sacrifices. This is a book I was going to write along with Ken Robinson, the sort of high-profile TED speaker, but unfortunately he passed away very early in the outbreak. But I'm still planning on taking all this research I've been talking about and really putting it together. The point isn't that you have to go out and be completely self-sacrificing. Just live a life of small sacrifices. Appreciate that some things are more important than you. And the paradox is your life will be better. Practice courage. And then here's the last one. And it's the most amazing. And it ties back to where we started it, almost as though it was planned. Once you do those things, you get to be the role model for everyone around you. Peer role models are so much more powerful than celebrity role models. It's so easy for someone to look at a famous person and think, yeah, but that's them. They're unusual. They're special. They're different. They're not me. In fact, the whole world sees it that way. I really don't think when venture capitalists are thinking about whether to fund my company, they're thinking, oh, but this is this weird transgender woman who tells dirty jokes on stage and doesn't know how to actually run a business. I will tell you, though, that is what they thought the first time I tried to start a company. But nowadays, they see me as a pretty unique character. And so they call me up wanting to investigate. And we see that a lot, actually. The more of an outlier you are, the less stereotypes tend to adhere to you in people's minds. But boy, what does it take to get past that in the early moments of your life, in your career? It's brutal. And, for someone who's actually seen both sides of it, I started one single little company in another life decades and decades ago, and it was so easy. Despite how terribly bad the company was and the fact that I'd flunked out of school. And then, I don't know, 15 years later, I started this company I had a couple of PhDs to my name and cool technology that everybody loved. And nobody wanted to fund us. One VC patted me on the head and told me, oh, you should be so proud of what you built. I was like, motherfucker, I don't want you to touch me. And I don't want your praise. I want your money because this is a good business. But he couldn't see that. So that's the last one. The last lesson here is, as scary as it is, and there's a degree to which I'm asking you to jump off a cliff, believing you're going to end up higher when you land than when you started. That's the kind of story about purpose. But practice it. Start small. Practice courage when it's easy. Practice making those small sacrifices when maybe they don't cost you that much, and build those muscles. Get good at it. And if you ever feel like you're having a hard moment, just remember, it's not just you. Every person that comes after you, everyone from your neighborhood or your people, if that's how you see it, you will transform their lives. And so that little extra you got to pay, don't think of it as paying to the person who's not paying you enough. Think of it as paying it forward to the person who's coming after you that's going to get a fair wage. So yeah, that's sorry, that was a little ranty, and I think we're still one question into this thing.
But you know what? I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your transparency again. I think you dropped a ton of knowledge in the beginning about AI, and I love that you're weaving your story, your journey, your hopes and encouragement. There have been people dropping in the chat box saying thank you. So since we do have 1 minute left, I would love to have you on more. In fact, I am going to reach out to you so that I can just hear you. We'll make some virtual fireside chats or something like that. But how can people connect with you? How can they support the work that you're doing? I know that you are working on a lot of different things, but if you can lead us to when this conversation ends in about 30 seconds, where can we find you?
Absolutely. Visit socos.org, SOCOS, and you can learn about the work that we do and the stories that we tell. It's one of the things I learned as a scientist is science is a story. And appropriate for today, that story should be about an hour long. And by the way, I do see in the chat about neurodiverse people. I work in the field of neurotechnologies, cyborgs, if you will. Here's my one thing I'm going to say about all technology, and it'll be my big close. AI, neurotechnologies, everything. We should not only be better when we're using them, we should be better than where we started when we turn them off again. And any technology that doesn't pass that bar shouldn't be deployed, ever. And this includes recognizing that my autistic son is amazing. He's got superpowers. I don't need those cured. What I need is something that just makes it a little easier for him to understand other people and other people to understand him. And the cool thing is, I got to build that. Google gave me a pair of Google Glass, and I built one of the first systems that read facial expressions. And it turns out kids with autism are better able to learn how to read facial expressions when they're actually interacting with real people instead of cartoon flashcards. So there's a ton of work in this space, thinking about using artificial intelligence to bridge divides rather than create them.
What a beautiful way to end this conversation. Thank you so much. I definitely recommend everyone reach out and support the beautiful work that you are stirring up over there. I hope to see you here in Patagonia one day, but that's another conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Vivienne, thank you.